Close your eyes for a moment, my friends, and imagine a world where fear slowly becomes hatred, and hatred slowly becomes law. Some stories are painful to hear, but this is one of those stories that helps us understand not only history, but the fragile heart of human society. Welcome to English Mindwave. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and support this journey. It truly helps bring more thoughtful stories like this to life. Tonight, we are walking into a difficult question. Why did Adolf Hitler hate the Jews? And how did that hatred grow so large that it became not only a private obsession, but a national policy, and one of history's greatest moral catastrophes? To answer that, we cannot begin with the camps, or even with the war. The story starts earlier, in disappointment, wounded pride, social resentment, and dangerous ideas that slowly found a home in a troubled mind and a troubled society. Because the Holocaust did not begin with killing. It began when hatred first started to sound reasonable. Long before Hitler became a symbol of destruction, he was a young man with a dream that seemed almost ordinary. He wanted to be an artist. He wanted recognition, purpose, and a place in the world. Vienna appeared to be the city where that future might unfold. But the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts rejected him, and then rejected him again. That failure became deeply personal. It wounded pride and left behind humiliation, bitterness, and the feeling that the world had denied him something important. After those rejections, Hitler drifted through Vienna in poverty. He lived in shelters and sold postcards and moved through the city as someone who felt forgotten. But Vienna was not only a city of beauty and culture. Beneath its elegance lived nationalism, prejudice, social anxiety, and political bitterness. Hatred toward Jews often appeared not as something shameful, but as something useful, a convenient explanation in a society filled with insecurity and resentment. This matters because people in pain often look for stories that make their suffering feel meaningful. Instead of accepting failure as failure, Hitler encountered a world eager to blame minorities for change and decline. The Jewish community, visible in commerce, art, science, and intellectual life, became an easy target in a society already prepared to resent it. One powerful figure in that atmosphere was Karl Lueger, Vienna's openly anti-Semitic mayor. He showed how resentment could be sharpened into political energy, and how blame could become applause. Vienna did not yet turn Hitler into a mass murderer, but it gave him a language of grievance. It taught him that bitterness, if aimed at the right target, could become ideology. That is one of the hardest truths in this story. Great horrors rarely begin in dramatic ways. They begin in newspapers, public speeches, everyday conversations, and small acts of moral surrender. They begin when cruelty first sounds persuasive. Then history gave Hitler something even more dangerous than private resentment. It gave him a wounded nation. When the First World War began in 1914, Hitler found in it something his earlier life had failed to provide: purpose. He volunteered for the German army and served on the Western Front as a messenger. A dangerous role that gave him structure, identity, and the feeling of serving something greater than himself. But the deepest scar did not come from battle. It came from defeat. When Germany collapsed in 1918, Hitler could not accept the outcome as a normal military loss. Like many Germans, he experienced it as humiliation. In that moment, truth struggled to compete with myth. This is where the stab-in-the-back legend gained its power. The false belief that Germany had not truly been defeated by outside enemies, but betrayed from within by Jews, communists, and other supposed internal traitors. There was no serious evidence for this myth. But myths do not spread because they are true. They spread because they satisfy emotional hunger. Germany was humiliated, angry, and desperate for a story that would make its pain easier to carry. The Treaty of Versailles deepened that crisis. Germany lost territory, faced heavy reparations, accepted blame for the war, and saw its military strength reduced. For millions, this felt less like a settlement and more like humiliation, written into the future. For Hitler, this was the moment when personal bitterness fused with national anger. What Vienna had planted, defeat now strengthened. His resentment no longer belonged only to a failed artist looking for excuses. It attached itself to a larger story of betrayal, decline, and revenge. In his mind, Jews became not merely a scapegoat, but the central enemy in a poisoned vision of history. And this is where the danger becomes clearer. A resentful man had found a resentful country. And when private hatred begins to speak in the voice of national suffering, it can stop sounding like madness to those who are desperate enough to believe. Germany, in the 1920s, was a place of deep instability. Inflation destroyed savings. Economic hardship broke families. Political violence shook public life. Many people no longer wanted patient, complicated answers. They wanted certainty. They wanted rescue. That was the opening Hitler needed. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, a small extremist group that at first seemed insignificant. But what made him dangerous was not the size of the movement. It was his ability to speak directly to humiliation. His speeches were emotional performances. He could take fear, confusion, and resentment and reshape them into rage. He offered audiences a world in which every pain had a villain, and every crisis had a target. As he rose within the movement, the German Workers' Party became the Nazi Party. Hitler understood that politics is not driven by argument alone. People are moved by symbols, uniforms, music, flags, rituals, and the emotional energy of crowds. Nazi politics became spectacle. It offered more than a program. It offered belonging. It gave frightened people the illusion that they were part of something strong and historically meaningful. That is how dangerous politics often works. It does not simply persuade. it seduces. In 1925, Hitler published Mein Kampf, laying out the worldview that would later shape the Nazi state: authoritarian rule, racial struggle, hatred of Jews, and the idea of Lebensraum. What mattered was not only the book, but what it represented. Hatred was no longer merely emotional. It was being organized into a political system. Then came the Great Depression. Millions lost jobs. Businesses collapsed. Banks failed. Democracy appeared weak and helpless. Hitler used that crisis with devastating skill. He promised order, pride, employment, and renewal. But those promises rested on a poisoned foundation: obedience to power and the identification of enemies. By 1933, Hitler became chancellor. The Reichstag fire gave him the chance to crush opposition, strip away freedoms, and expand state control. In 1934, he declared himself Führer. From that moment on, antisemitism no longer lived only in speeches or slogans. It moved into the machinery of government. Jews were pushed out of public office, shut out of professions, denied legal equality, and slowly stripped of a normal place in German society. The destruction of dignity did not come all at once. It came step by step, law by law, until cruelty began to look ordinary. And once a society learns to see injustice as normal, the road to something darker becomes frighteningly short. When the Nazis took power, hatred became a system. Propaganda portrayed Jews not as human beings with ordinary lives and families, but as threats and sources of contamination. That language mattered because before people are destroyed physically, they are often pushed outside the moral universe first. Jews were forced to wear the Star of David. They were driven from homes, cut off from normal life, and concentrated into ghettos where overcrowding, hunger, disease, and fear became everyday reality. These were not accidental side effects of war. They were part of a deliberate structure of suffering. Then, after the invasion of Poland and the expansion of Nazi control, that process moved toward something even more terrible, what the regime called the final solution. The phrase sounds cold and administrative, and that is part of what makes it so horrifying. It hid unspeakable violence behind official language. Beginning in 1942, extermination camps in occupied Poland, including Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek, became centers of industrialized killing. These were not ordinary prisons and not simply labor camps. They were designed for mass murder. People arrived by train, selections were made in minutes, and lives were reduced to categories of immediate death or temporary labor. At Auschwitz, elderly people, children, and many women were sent directly to the gas chambers, while others were worked until their bodies gave out. And perhaps this is the point where the story becomes almost unbearable, Because what happened was not chaos. It was scheduling, record-keeping, administration, and a state stripped of conscience. The Holocaust revealed not only hatred, but the terrifying efficiency of a modern system without ethics. Civilization, when detached from moral responsibility, can become a weapon. When Allied forces liberated the camps, they found survivors, reduced to shadows, communities destroyed, and evidence of suffering beyond ordinary language. Yet even freedom did not immediately heal what had been broken. Many survivors had no homes to return to, no families left, and no clear future. For many Jews, the dream of home turned toward Palestine. But even that journey was difficult. Immigration was restricted, the region was tense, and the future remained uncertain. Even so, some survivors moved toward a place where they hoped to begin again. In 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, part of that shattered world found a new starting point, though not without pain and further historical complexity. The Holocaust also destroyed far more than lives. It shattered language, culture, faith, and memory. Entire Yiddish-speaking worlds were devastated. Writers such as Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and Viktor Frankl later tried to give words to what seemed almost beyond words. Their testimonies became part of humanity's moral archive, helping later generations understand how such horror became possible. And perhaps that is the lesson history places in our hands tonight. Great tragedies do not begin with their final form. They begin quietly, in language, in fear, in blame, and in the habit of seeing other people as less human than ourselves. That is why remembering this story matters so deeply, not only for the past, but for the present. For those learning English through stories like there is something meaningful here too. Every time you stay with a difficult story, every time you listen with patience, every time you try to understand a painful chapter of human history in another language, you are doing something brave. You are not only learning words, you are widening your understanding of the world. My friends, here is a simple question for you. Do you think hatred in society begins more often with fear or with ignorance? Please share your thoughts politely in the comments so we can learn together. And if you want more calm, meaningful stories like this, please subscribe to English Mindwave.